Thanks. Good morning. It's a joy to be here with you, worshipping and looking at God's word together. I've just got one verse today, which we'll come to in a second. But just want to recap where we were last time, a few weeks ago in this series. We saw that Paul said, we don't know what to pray for. And it encourages me that Paul is saying we there, not you. Not I know what to pray for, because I'm Paul. You don't know what to pray for. He says we don't know what to pray for. And so if Paul is including himself in that, we have to conclude that this is something to be expected in the Christian life, a limit given to us by God. We don't know what to pray for because we simply don't always know what God is up to. We don't know his will. We don't know his plan. In so many situations in our lives, we don't know what he's doing. Right? And I think this can feel painful and frustrating. A lot of the pain in my Christian life has come from believing that I will have peace when I have an answer to the question, what is God doing in this situation? What is this pain for? Do you ever feel like that? Do you ever feel like the suffering you're in would be so much easier to bear if you could just have some insight into what on earth God was doing? There are situations in all of our lives that simply don't make sense to us. Circumstances that we really would not have chosen for ourselves. Suffering that doesn't feel like it's achieving anything. Over the past year, for me, there have been situations in which I've said to God, I found myself saying, I really want to trust you in this, but I really would sleep more easily if you could just tell me what the plan is. But in all that we simply don't know in the Christian life, particularly when we suffer, today's verse, which actually we have heard quoted in multiple prayers around the room as we've been praying for our city today, today's verse is a pillow on which to lay our heads and rest. It's a secure rock on which we can place our feet, because today's verse is Romans 8:28. And it tells us what we do know God is doing in the most confusing situations we find ourselves in. It tells us what he is doing when we suffer, and on the most mundane days of our lives, and on everything in between. And we know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. In all things, God works for the good of those who love him. This is a load-bearing verse in the Christian life. This one verse can take the weight of all that we don't know and say that here is what I do know. I may not know how this current situation is going to work out. I may not know what will happen with my health in the coming years, where I'm going to be living or working in a year's time. I may not know if I will get an answer to the prayer that I have been praying. I may not know if what I'm asking for so desperately will be given to me. I may not know what to pray for. But here is what I do know in each of these things. In all things, God is working for my good. The ESV puts it that for those who love God, all things work together for good. Not a single detail of my life will turn out to have been random or insignificant. What this verse invites us to plant our feet on today is that the care of God, the attention of God, the sovereignty of God go deeper and further than we could ever dare hope if he hadn't gone into print to say it. In the face of all the biggest unknowns of my life, the unanswered questions, the unanswered prayers, in the suffering that doesn't make sense, in the valley, the wilderness, the storm, and the fire, God is, in the words of John Stott, ceaselessly, energetically, and purposefully active on my behalf. And this means that I don't have to wait for answers in order to have peace. If I was going into surgery, it would not necessarily help me to know the step-by-step plan of all that the surgeon was going to do. Don't need to see all the instruments they're going to use. In fact, I'd rather not. I don't need to know all the possible outcomes. What I do need to do is trust the surgeon and trust that they know what they're doing. In the same way, my peace doesn't come from having all the answers, but from trusting in the one who does. And I know that while this sounds like a lovely way to live, I am aware this is easier to say than to do. So, God in his kindness and his wisdom, he knows this. He knows this is hard to live. So he doesn't just give us instructions, thou shalt trust me, although he could. He doesn't only give us promises like this one, precious as they are. He also gives us stories. Some of those stories come from our own lives and our history with God. Some of them come from other people. If you're part of this church, then I'm sure there are stories in this very room that have been an encouragement to you to keep going when you don't know what God is doing. He gives us stories because we are story people. And some of the stories that God has given us, he has written into history and told us in his word. Now, I think one of the stories that most beautifully illustrates this verse this morning is the story of a man called Joseph. Now, Joseph gets more airtime in the book of Genesis, the first book of the Bible, than any other character. More than Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Adam. When it comes to Joseph, the gritty details, the ups and downs of his story are so important because in them we see ourselves. So here is the story of Joseph and his God who works all things together for good. So we meet Joseph as a teenage shepherd. He is the youngest of 11 brothers. If you have many siblings, I wonder if you might be able to relate to what he might have felt a bit like. He was actually the favourite child of his father, Jacob. But that wouldn't actually make things particularly simple for Joseph, because to really rub his favouritism in, Jacob gave Joseph a conspicuously brightly coloured coat. And you can imagine that this didn't actually make Joseph particularly popular with his older brothers. In fact, we read that they hated him. Now, this was a situation that Joseph had no control over as a child or teenager, but just through the circumstances of his birth, he found himself hated, not just by one brother, but by 10. Maybe there were situations in your childhood that you had no control over that caused pain and confusion for you as a child. Maybe you've looked at other families, or you looked at other families growing up and you questioned God, why couldn't I just have what they have? Would it have been so hard to put me in an easier family? Or perhaps even you'd say, I love my family, but this part of my childhood, that part of my childhood was really hard, and I'm still dealing with the consequences today, or realizing the consequences today. What on earth was God doing in that situation? So Joseph starts having vivid dreams from God, and these dreams involve his brothers all bowing down to him. Perhaps like any teenage boy would do in this situation, he tells his brothers these dreams in detail twice. We don't know Joseph's motivation in his heart for sharing the dreams, but it was perhaps not the wisest thing he could have done for interfamilial relationships. What we do know is this was the final straw for Joseph's brothers, who plot to kill their dreamer, as they call him, of a brother, and they plot to murder him, but then they sell him into slavery to some passing traders for 20 silver pieces. Traipsing behind maybe a camel for 300 miles through the desert to Egypt, Joseph probably had a lot of time to think. Maybe one of those thoughts was regret. If only I hadn't told them about the dreams, or why did I have to wear that coat all the time? What could I have done differently? Or maybe he questioned God. Why did you give me that dream in the first place if you knew this would happen to me? Why did you let this happen to me? Maybe there are things you have said or done that you regret deeply. Maybe you even felt you were doing the right thing at the time, but you now live with the painful consequences and you wish you could go back and undo the past. Maybe you made unwise decisions when you were younger that you would give anything to go back and change. Or maybe there are questions that you ask God in honest moments, like Joseph may have here. Why did you put these dreams in me if they weren't going to go anywhere? Why would you give me this desire or this promise in the first place if it was going to cause me so much pain? So next we find Joseph. He ends up working in Egypt for an illustrious politician called Potiphar. Joseph actually works really hard in his job. He's diligent. He's careful with what's in front of him. He does well. His work prospers, and he's given more responsibility. But day after day, working in someone else's estate, in a land desperately far from family and the roots of his faith, I wonder if Joseph would have found himself thinking, what am I doing here? What good is this doing? His father was Jacob, the grandson of Abraham. And here he was in a nation worshipping false gods, working for a stranger in a strange land. Maybe you are in a job situation in which you find yourself asking similar questions. What am I doing here? Am I achieving anything for the kingdom in this workplace that doesn't honor God? There's a difficult environment to talk about God in. What is God doing in the mundanity and the drudgery of my day-to-day life? Have I taken a wrong turning somewhere? So maybe Joseph is just beginning to settle into his new life in Egypt. And then another massive blow sideswipes his whole life. Joseph is falsely accused of attacking Potiphar's wife, and he is thrown into prison by his master. Maybe you have been sinned against, wronged by someone you love or someone you didn't know at all. Maybe things have happened to you through no fault of your own that have left you bewildered and confused. Or maybe you feel like you've somehow found yourself in a prison of sickness or mental illness or a situation you feel trapped in, and you question, how did I end up here? Maybe you can see how some suffering could be character building, grow you as a person, but this just feels so random, so obscure that you don't even know how to think about it or how to pray about it. This was definitely my situation, suffering with my mental health. I felt trapped and confused, and maybe just like Joseph in that prison, there was no clear end in sight. So here's what happens next. Joseph gets a reputation as someone who can interpret dreams from God. And he finds himself interpreting the dream of Pharaoh himself. And he gives Pharaoh wisdom from God about how to deal with an upcoming famine. So Pharaoh's really impressed with Joseph, and he sets him as ruler over all the land of Egypt. 7 years later, back in Canaan with Jacob and his sons, the famine has struck their land too. But they've heard there might be food in Egypt. So Joseph's brothers make the long journey 300 miles through the desert to the land of the Pharaohs, where they come before a governor and bow down before him. Maybe we can imagine Joseph's life flashing before his eyes in this moment. The dreams God gave him as a child, all the suffering and confusion that followed, and now his dream being fulfilled as his brothers bow down before him, unknowingly pleading for their lives from the one that they left for dead. Here's what Joseph said to them. This is in Genesis 45. So Joseph said to his brothers, "Come near to me, please," because he recognizes them, but they don't know that it's him. And they came near, and he said, "I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. And now, do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are yet 5 years in which there will neither be plowing nor harvest. And God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God." And then a bit later, Joseph says, "As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good." I think Joseph could have said, in other words, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. Joseph was misunderstood, sold for silver coins, falsely accused, isolated, left for dead at the hands of sinful men. But now at this point in his life, he looks back over the long years of suffering and he sees that in every moment, God was one step ahead, carefully telling a story with Joseph's life and suffering that would result in salvation for thousands of people and even glory for Joseph. But we know this story already, don't we? A story in which the evil intent of man becomes the very thing that God uses to bring about his greatest good. Jesus was misunderstood, sold for silver coins, falsely accused, isolated, and left for dead at the hands of sinful men. And at the same time, God was unrolling a plan that had been in place in the heart of God from before the foundation of the world. See, on the cross, we see the fullest extent of the evil that man or Satan can unleash. And yet, this is the very place and time of God's greatest victory. The cross is the culmination, it is the center point of this promise. We know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love him. Romans 8:28 is already our story because the gospel is already our story. So when we hear this verse and we think, oh, that sounds wonderful, but how could God possibly bring good from this thing in my life, or from this evil that I've experienced, or this evil that I have done? Look at the cross and see that before Romans 8:28 is a description of the Christian's future hope, it is a description of the story that has already saved us. He has already worked the suffering and devastation of the cross for our good. And so we live cross-shaped lives now. Our lives follow this same pattern that's at the heart of the story of Jesus, that's at the heart of the story of our faith. Life from death, his strength made perfect, not just despite our suffering, but somehow in the very darkest things themselves. If he did it at the cross, will he not show himself now to be the same storyteller, the same faithful Father, the same God who brings beauty from ashes? This means that in all of those ways that we can see ourselves in Joseph's story, we know he is at work. It means that the unique circumstances of your childhood, the things that you wish had been different, he was at work. He says, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. He saw you as a child, as a teenager. He was preparing everything even then. It means that in the mundanity of day-to-day life and work, errands and appointments, taking the car to the garage, finishing that assignment, endless job hunting or feeling stuck in a job that you just can't see much purpose in, when our days feel obscure or tedious, when our own plans never seem to work out as we'd like, when we had dreams when we were younger that turned out much harder to achieve than we ever thought they would be, we can rest that the purpose of our lives is not contained in the meaning that we discern in the moment, but in the promise of God to weave together every thread of our lives for a good purpose that he has prepared in advance. When we feel in prison, when we look around and ask, what on earth is going on and how have I found myself here? Suffering with the same depression again, in undiagnosable pain for yet another year. When we don't know the why, we can trust the who. The storyteller who has not abandoned your story to go and write a more interesting one, but who is attentive to every single word. In my suffering with mental health, it was the revelation that he was with me and working even though I couldn't always see it that changed everything for me. Well, finally, what about if we hear these things and we think that actually we can relate more to Joseph's brothers than to Joseph? What if it feels like We are the ones that have done the terrible things. Well, remember these words that Joseph says to his brothers and hear them as the words of Jesus to you today. And now, do not be distressed or angry with yourselves. God used the brothers' darkest moment in his plan to save them. If you have put your trust in Jesus' work on the cross, the thing that you most regret, God will use even that for his glory and for your good in the end. And just to finish, maybe this has all led you to a very obvious question. What precisely does Paul mean by good in this verse? Because it doesn't mean that your past year couldn't have been easier or nicer or had more good things in it, obviously. So what does it mean that God is working all things for my good? Because sometimes things don't feel very good, right? What it means is that every finite thing we experience in this life that we would call good is a shadow of our greatest good, which is to know Jesus, to call him our own, to be like him. And if God needs to withhold earthly goods or temporary goods for a time to reveal to us the surpassing worth of Christ and to form his character in us, then he will. And we know that to get to Christ-likeness, to get to his character formed in us, we follow the same path as Christ through suffering. As Keller says, Jesus didn't suffer on the cross so that you would not suffer. He suffered so that when you suffer, you would become like him. Goodness for us looks like following our Jesus through suffering now and into unimaginable glory to come. It's because Jesus can see the end from the beginning that his definition of good is not the same as ours. And that means I can't be trusted to decide what goodness ultimately is for me. When I was a teenager growing up, where I grew up, a youth leader said to us, "Trust God until he lets you down." Now, that sounds quite pithy, right? Sounds like, well, that's good advice. And I think, obviously, they thought it was very good advice because God will never let you down. The only problem with this advice was that it invited a 14-year-old me to be the judge of what constitutes the faithfulness of God. It turns out that's actually a really bad idea. Because how many times a day, especially at 14, could I look around at a circumstance and feel let down by God? My definition of the goodness of God cannot rise and fall with the circumstances of my life. I need something much more certain than that. I need to know that in every moment of my life, whether I can see it or not, that God is working all things together for my good. I need to know Jesus. Jesus with me, Jesus given to me in his fullness, in the prison cells and the deserts and the day-to-day of my life. We're going to take communion in just a second. But before I do, I wonder actually if you're able to, if you would be happy to stand. Just going to read this verse again a couple of times. And as I do, if it's helpful for you, perhaps think about those things that feel most confusing right now. Maybe some of these things that I've mentioned and I felt like, oh, that's a bit close to home. We're going to put all that we don't know this morning onto this sure foundation of what we do know. And we know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. And we know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. If you are a Christian, if you've made a decision to follow Jesus, then communion is for you in just a second. Actually, yeah, why don't we go and get communion now, a piece of bread and the cup, and bring it back to your seats, and we'll take it all together. Gluten-free is on my right, your left. Great. If you're happy to stand, let's stand as we take this together. A lot of exercise for you. And we're going to start by taking the bread. I'll just stall for a bit.